Today's debate is titled For and Against Truth. So the questions we're going to be talking about today are what truth is, whether it can survive, and indeed whether it should. There's much to discuss here. For a bit of context, I'd just like to interject a note of context from last week's publication of an article in Third World Quarterly titled The Case for Colonialism. Some of you might have seen this or seen discussion about it. Bruce Gilley from the Department of Political Science in Portland State University writes, Western colonialism was, as a general rule, both objectively beneficial and subjectively legitimate in most of the places where it was found. So as you can expect, this has attracted some discussion on Twitter, for example. So I'll just read you a tweet here, which I think is fairly indicative of those who would like to see the paper retracted. Quote, ridiculous that Third World Quarterly would publish this execrable article that calls for a return to colonialism. Also badly argued. So I think this tweet's kind of telling because it makes clear that the moral reasons for rejecting Gilley's claims are distinct from the rational ones. And it shows how the kind of moral position is mixed up with, with the questions of whether the argument is clear and whether the facts actually hold. So anyway, the reason why I raise it here is to imagine the implications of what our position might be on truth after our discussion today in terms of how we might be able to evaluate Gilley's claims and see who on Twitter is right and who's wrong, if that's possible at all. So the speakers today, many of you know them all well, are Colin Wight, over at the end there, who is Chair of the Department of Government and International Relations, John Keane in the centre, who is at the Sydney Democracy Network, and Carolyn West on the left, as I'm standing, in the Department of Philosophy, all here at the University of Sydney. They're each members of the Post-Truth Initiative that I mentioned before, and today they're going to be bringing into the open, front and centre, a discussion that we've been having on the edges of the many meetings we've been having in the Post-Truth Initiative over the months that we've been working together this year. So I'm looking very much forward to it. What's going to happen is that... Who's going first? John?
I think I was forced to.
Okay, so John will speak for 10 minutes or so. Colin will speak for 10 minutes or so. Carolyn will have some commentary. And then we're very grateful if people would jump in and, get involved in the discussion. That's the most interesting part of the Sydney Ideas events that I am part of, is the audience involvement. So we're certainly intending that it turn into an open discussion with a roving mic. So without further ado, let's hand over to John, please.
Well, thank you very much, Nick. It feels a little bit like a Turkish bath in here. Thank you all very much for coming. You'll find out pretty quickly that if I had another middle name, it would be called Skeptic. Because I'm going to tell you the truth, and the whole truth, and nothing but the truth about truth. And I want to begin with the most obvious, you're all aware of an orthodoxy that settled, particularly among the middle classes, most of you are here, about the subject of truth. It goes like this. The orthodoxy says, we've entered a period of truthiness, Stephen Colbert. Post-truth is upon us. Bullshit, lying, deliberate obfuscation in public life has become detrimental to democracy. It's poisoning public life, ruining civil society, corrupting politics. And so what's needed, according to this orthodoxy, is the recovery of truth. What's truth? How is it understood? Well, truth is seen to be observable. Truth is saying or representing something around us, out there, in a way that captures that reality. There are complicated versions of this. The great Polish-American mathematician Alfred Tarski famously put it in terms of the proposition that snow is white is true if snow is white. There are cruder versions of this. In every case, as I see it, this orthodoxy treats language as a kind of conveyor belt. It's a sort of neutral medium for capturing reality. And the cruder versions runs, facts are facts, mate. Evidence is evidence. This table is real. So is gravity. So is that wall. Reality is real. Brute reality is brute reality. And that's a fact. You may know that this orthodoxy has been embraced by more than a few journalists, some academics, plenty of environmental scientists, and even some philosophers talk in this way. They've become verophiles, lovers of truth, believers in truth. They have a habit of supposing that when we talk about truth, we talk about something a little bit beyond our arm's length, some reality that can be captured through language. So truth is a kind of exercise in grasping or catching reality, for instance, in the form of data. You'll see that I want to speak against this because it seems to me that the whole way of thinking about truth is misleading, it's illusory. And I want to do this initially by presenting a short geography and history of truth. It goes something like this. The first matter, geography, I want to point out to you something that's pretty obvious when you start pondering it, which is that there are spatial variations in what counts as truth and what counts as truth-telling. The great French Renaissance writer Montaigne said famously that truth on one side of the Pyrenees is falsehood on the other. And we could develop that idea. Think about the way Michel Foucault analyzes the clinic as a particular geographic site for the production of new knowledge that counts of truth. Or think of the way cities have shaped the way we think about truth. The Chicago School of Economics, or the London School of Economics and Political Science. Or think of the way in which, for example, Chinese people, when they speak about truth, here I go, 真理, 真相, 真实, 真知, don't understand, when they use those terms interchangeably for truth, they don't understand what generally is understood in Aldalia by truth. And not only that, but the geography of truth varies within any given society. Let's take the example of the Pitjantjatjara peoples of Central Australia. As I understand it, they have a family of terms, mula, mula mulani, mulapa, to describe something out there, and when they say that, they actually always tack on to that sentence a question mark. That is to say, when Pitjantjatjara peoples speak about truth, as it's translated, then they actually put it in the form of a question. You could say that what they've understood and what lots of white fellas have not understood is that truth and trust are twins. Truth, when we speak about truth, we're actually appealing for others to agree with us, to win their trust. Then, thinking about the geography of truth, let's take some other examples. Bertolt Brecht, the great German playwright, said, if someone stands up in front of a group of strikers and says 2 + 2 = 4, you can be sure that they will be jeered. I mean, the point is that truth, as a way of believing and behaving, is appropriate to certain places and not to others. Try having a meal with a friend where you go on and on about truth through the meal. You're bound to spoil the meal. And in my experience, no good sex ever happened with references to truth. Never. And, we could say this about satire and jokes, irony, or Colin will, I think, have to agree to this. Truth has nothing to do with playing guitar at the Marquee Club on Wardour Street, which I hereby reveal Colin once did. It's a very famous club in London, but I'm sure it had nothing to do with truth. So the point is that what counts as truth varies through space, but it also varies through time. So here we go with the history of truth. You will know from this, maybe. Oh no, there it is. It's already up. You may know that there is a history of truth, the way the Greeks spoke about truth, and which was much discussed, I think, in this room by John Anderson last century. Aletheia is an understanding of truth as disclosure, as kind of revealing things. It's a very different understanding than, for example, the orthodoxy with which I began. Or think of the way Christians have historically spoken about the life and the truth and the way, Jesus Christ, and so on. Or look at this image from the early 18th century. This is actually truth as a woman being rescued from falsehood by time. It's a very strange image. And it, of course, makes us recoil, or many of us recoil, or even chuckle or curse at the gendering of truth. Truth has often been a woman. So that's a brief history and a brief geography of history, all in about 2 minutes, to try to persuade you that actually this understanding of truth that's about in the public arena at the moment, this orthodoxy as I describe it, is actually questionable. And I think that there are 4 implications of this history and geography, this brief history and geography of truth. The first is the most obvious. Truth does have a history, and it does have a geography, and it should rattle those of you who actually believe that facts are facts and truth is somehow a set of statements that correspond to reality. And I'm sorry to spoil your afternoon in saying this, but the point that this first point is that that understanding of truth with which I began is contingent. It's time, space specific. It's very local. If you think that we're on the royal road to truth, Karl Popper thought that. I think that's most unlikely. Let's debate it. And if you think that philosophers, since we're in the philosophy room, can rescue us from the confusion about truth and sort out everything, then I think it's clear that if you look at the last century of philosophical discussion, it's left us in a mess. It's actually produced some sort of bog, or some kind of, what could we call it, a dunny dispute would be the local vernacular, between realists and anti-realists, and between those who, in turn, have been much more influenced by Nietzsche and by Heidegger and by the pragmatists and by Wittgenstein and Jacques Derrida and Dick Rorty. And you'll see that already that I've been influenced by them. So, and finally, if you're expecting to be rescued by journalists for truth, I think forget it. It's a word that comes to the lips of many journalists in their self-defense to describe what they do, but actually most have never thought it through very deeply. This is the first point, that we ought to be rattled by this conventional view that facts are facts and reality is, you know, a bunch of statements that refer to this as a table, and that statement is true. The second implication, there are 4, is that I want to emphasize the importance of interpretations. You know, this word is underestimated. It's underused. What I'm saying to you is an interpretation. It's a particular account. It's an attempt to explain. It's an appeal for you to understand what I'm saying to you. But it's only an interpretation. And this, I think, raises the much bigger point. Nietzsche was the one to say it very firmly in the 19th century, towards the end of the 19th century. The truth, as he put it, is a mobile army of metaphors. And those metaphors operate within a linguistic community. So language becomes very important for this understanding of interpretation. You could say that interpretation is an act. It's a performative act. And it's an attempt to actually appeal to others that what we're saying, when we say something is true, to appeal to them to agree with us. To say that's true means we approve, we agree with others, or call upon them to agree. And I remind you that truth and trust are 2 words in English that have a common etymology. There are many statements of this that put this point
about the importance of interpretation very clearly. Think of Wittgenstein. All knowledge, he wrote in a wonderful one-sentence line, rests upon acknowledgement of others. Or William James, I quote, "The true is the name of whatever proves itself to be good in the way of belief, and good too for definite, assignable reasons." Or surely the shortest sentence by a contemporary philosopher, Gianni Fattimo, Italy's greatest living philosopher, in my view, truth is persuasion. Truth is persuasion. And this point that when we describe something as true, when we speak about truth, that it's done through a language framework and that it is an interpretation is backed up by all kinds of interesting puzzles. Max Weber, you may know, the great German sociologist, insisted that objectivity, no, he insisted, I'll put it differently, that the world comprises an infinity of details. And that when we describe reality and we say this is a fact, or what we are doing is selecting from the myriad of possibilities. So every statement of fact actually happens in and through a language framework, and it has a selectivity. This is Wittgenstein's duck-rabbit. I leave it to you whether it's a duck or a rabbit. And the point of making this, putting emphasis on this importance of interpretation, is that this chronically happens in public life today. So that, for example, when Jean-Marie Le Pen, the grandfather of French populism, said that Shoah was a minor detail, he was doing exactly what I'm describing. He's claiming that this is a fact, he's claiming this is true, but in fact he's in the business of interpreting things. Or when Prime Minister Modi in India says that it's true that India is a Hindu nation, that Hindutva is what all Indians should embrace, this kind of claim is also an interpretation. I can give you many other examples. Third, and getting near the end, I can hear the word relativism surfacing from somewhere around this table, and I can hear the word postmodern probably creeping in the door as I speak. The reaction to the kind of interpretation I'm putting to you, that truth is itself an interpretation, that it has a history and geography, typically breeds the reaction, oh my God, you're saying that when Stephen Hawking talks about philosophy and time, that his views about philosophy and time are as good as, my plumbers, or the woman who is the pedestrian crossing monitor on Glebe Point Road. Are you really saying that? And by the way, you contradict yourself, because here you are asserting these things, you're actually saying that this is true, and therefore you undermine your so-called relativism. I don't like this argument very much. It used to. I saw Dick Rorty in action several times. When he would get that criticism, you know what his reaction was? You say there is no truth, but that itself is a statement of truth, therefore you contradict yourself. His reaction, always brilliant, was to shrug his shoulders and say nothing. He'd just shrug his shoulders. He wouldn't smile, ironically. That's the way he dealt with it. That's kind of my response to this sort of talk about relativism. And finally, what has all this got to do with democracy? It's a festival of democracy. What is this refusal of truth and the refusal of post-truth, what's it got to do with democracy? I think it has a great deal to do with democracy, because in the work that I've done, I did nothing else in my life but write about democracy and preach about it and broadcast and so on. It is, it seems to me, something like a way of life and a set of institutions that is a solution to the problem of post-truth, this populist lying and bullshit on the one hand, but it's also a solution to the problem of truth and its contingency. It's possible, and indeed what I want to suggest to you is that democracies don't require truth, and actually truth, Hannah Arendt said it very clearly, is anti-political. It destroys politics, because it supposes that when someone says this is true, it's a pompous claim that typically comes wrapped in power, and it actually is destructive of pluralism and of politics and of democracy. That's what I want to suggest to you. Now, one of the odd things about our times, if I may briefly elaborate and then I stop, is that there's lots of lip service to truth. It's a bit like, it seems to me, it's a bit like a ghost that prowls around in our lives. You know, just as we say the sun is setting, when what we really should say is that the earth is spinning, we carry on talking about truth, but it seems to me that the aura of truth is actually fading. And if we could go back in time, if we could sit in this lecture theatre in 1927 and hear John Anderson making a realist case against Christianity with a great deal of tension, with the Senate upset, tried to get rid of him, and so on and so forth, it's important to try to recall times when truth had a tremendous grip on people's lives. It seems to me, comparatively, in actually existing Western democracies, that grip is in decline. And yet there's lots of lip service, and this is the sort of ghostly prowling around in our lives. That's the point of the metaphor of the setting sun. Now I'm going to say something nearing the end that's very unpopular, because it would suggests that actually we might rethink Trump-style populism. What Trump-style populism is doing is that it's attacking those who claim to be carriers of truth, of the bearers of truth. Fake news sets the cat among the pigeons. What it also does is create a backlash whereby journalists and others rush towards truth without defining it very well and in terms of the orthodoxy that I've been attacking. What I want to say, in other words, is that the attack on fake news, that this populism of our times, a very democratic phenomenon, actually has a point to it. A point that it has, in effect, exposed the hypocrisies of truth, the illusions of truth, and it has, I think, or it will be seen in the long term as a contribution to the decline of truth. So, what has this to do with democracy and the way we understand it? You will know in the writings of those who doubt truth that there is a tendency to quietism and to strange relapses into metaphysics. Heidegger, you may know, allowed posthumously the publication of an interview in Der Spiegel where the punchline is, "Only a God can save us now." This is a strange, anti-political and also anti-democratic way of thinking. There were moments when Dick Rorty, I think, before his death, was remarkably blasé about the implications of his critique of truth. And he actually trusted in American democracy. He would not be trusting in American democracy if he were alive today. I want to say that I want to speak to you on the basis of a bit of experience with this question of truth and its illusions. Two things in my life affected what I'm now saying. One was that when I was much younger, sitting in the apartment of Václav Havel, with his dog barking permanently at the door because of the fear that the secret police would come, speaking to him about living in truth, by which he meant not truth as I understood it, but truth as dignity, truth as self-empowerment, truth as pluralistic. He was happy for the word to be used and believed that it was important for dissidents, those under the gun, as it were, of a very oppressive regime, to actually keep the word alive, but not to embrace the illusion that somehow they had a grasp on reality. And the other experience, which is in a way the opposite, some of you will not know that a couple of years ago, in the opening trial of journalists and scholars and others in Iran, I was named, together with Dick Rorty and Jürgen Habermas, as the three co-conspirators of the Velvet Counter-Revolution. And it was said that I lied. I was an agent of MI6 and the CIA. And putting together those two experiences, I came through the last decade or so to think that you can reconceive democracy as a way of life, as a set of institutions, as a language, as a spirit, a form of life, a way of handling power, which is the protector of pluralism, of diversity, and therefore of multiple opinions about the world, or if you like, multiple interpretations of the world. This is not quietism, because democracy so conceived, notice it doesn't have any metaphysical foundations. It's not true as a way of life. It is a way of protecting multiple truths. Notice that it also has a precautionary element. That is, to repeat, but to give a twist to the Churchill doctrine, democracy is so far the best way of handling power that can protect us against the illusions of truth, of the pomposity of talk of markets and state and sovereignty and those kinds of pompous big ideals. Democracy is a protector of living flesh and blood human beings, citizens and their representatives against truth. Thank you very much.
Thank you, John. I think, Colin, in the interest of fairness, you could have a little more than 15 minutes.
Yeah, no, it's okay. I only need 15 minutes. It is true John took more than 10 minutes. I mean, it is true, although it hasn't happened yet, that I will take less than John. Okay? So I can predict the future and control it. I haven't prepared anything really here, so I'm just going to bounce off some of the things John said. And because I've spoken about this a lot previously, I think I can do it off the top of my head. So let's see how we get on. I'm going to start with Rorty, though, and I'm going to end with Rorty, though, because it gives me two nice bookends. Since yeah, can you hear me? I mean, yeah, I think.
Oh, I didn't use it.
Stick it there. So I'm going to start with Rorty and end with Rorty, because Rorty, the way John described it, gives us two nice bookends. And that's the problem with you when you selectively pick out quotations from people. You can always find counters. So the counter I want to just start with here is Rorty from. So Rorty, I think it's about page 358 of Philosophy in the Mirror of Nature. Okay, so if you read the book, Rorty gets to the end of Philosophy in the Mirror of Nature, and he says, "Of course, nothing I've written here should be taken by anybody to be true." Right. And at that point, I just say, well, why the fuck didn't you tell me that at the beginning? And I wouldn't have bothered reading it. Okay, so if that's your argument, tell me up front. Anyway, so there's a couple of others. So John mentioned William James. James was also, though, the person, John, as you well know, that said a person that doesn't believe in truth is somebody who won't ask any questions. Okay, now, my favourite, since you mentioned her, is Hannah Arendt. And Hannah Arendt said, the ideal subject of totalitarianism is a people for whom the distinction between fact and fiction, true and false, no longer exists. Okay, so you can pick quotations to... And Nietzsche, by the way, from my point of view, is the worst person in the world to deal with this. Nietzsche can be employed for anything, for good, for bad, for evil, for environmentalism, anti-environmentalism, for fascism. Nietzsche can be cherry-picked for anything. That's because Nietzsche's not a systematic thinker in the same way Hegel is. So Nietzsche does not have a system. So I would avoid Nietzsche, but that's a personal predilection. So I want to say something about the concept of post-truth, say something where I think it comes from and how it operates, and then maybe respond to some of John's issues that he's kind of quite nicely raised, which I think he's done a great job in putting a lot of the things on the table. The one thing I think that John... And we had a discussion before we came in here. My argument, which I get into trouble for, is that I don't win arguments, arguments win arguments. So I'm only the bearer of the argument. If the argument's good, the argument will stand. And so John said to me, make sure I do that. So in UK football terms, it's play the ball, not the man. So, but I'm going to be referring to John, but John is just a kind of a token of a set of people that believe this way, yeah?
Yeah. Oh, great.
So my token John, I think, confuses claims to truth rather than truth, okay? So all of the stuff he says about claims to truth and interpretations, I don't really have much of a problem with. I have a problem with the way he reduces that to truth, just to that. Anyway, if I'll just start with the concept of post-truth, because it's kind of everywhere, and it's I think most people get it wrong. So I have a particular view on post-truth. So post-truth for me is not the fact that Donald Trump lies. It's not the fact that the people who were behind the leave Brexit, the Brexit Leave campaign lied. It's not the fact that your politicians probably don't tell you the truth 99.9% of the times. It's not the fact that you can't trust business elites and big business. That's what I call the field of production. We have a load of concepts, spin, propaganda, lies, for what goes on in that domain, and that is, that's been going on for centuries, and it will still go on now. Politicians, people in power, always have a vested interest in hiding the truth from you, and that's for me is the politics about it. That's why the truth, which is why I deeply disagree with John, is important. And that belief. What's interesting about John, and I am going to, by the way, when I get to the end, he's absolutely right. Tell him that he's performing what philosophers call a performative contradiction. His whole talk depends on truth. It doesn't work unless he's talking about a truth. And that, if I saw him do the introduction to the Glenn Greenwald event 2 or 3 weeks ago, and he said, I didn't get the exact phrase, he said, and everything Glenn says is true, or something like that when he introduced him. So he thinks it's there, it's if you want evidence, which I'm going to talk about a bit, it's online, okay? John saying something true. And actually, just before this, I mean, when I said I didn't do any preparation, I lied, but I did a bit of preparation, and I read something on monetary democracy, and in one paper, I don't know where it's published, he uses the word truth about 6 times in that. Now, we can have a debate about how he's defining truth in that context, but John still needs a definition of truth for his work to work. So I'll come back to that. Anyway, so post-truth is not about lying. It's not about politicians doing all of this stuff which we know and which Machiavelli says is at the heart of politics. Post-truth is actually more about the field of reception. It's a change in the way publics react to truth claims and to politicians lying. And there are various things going on here. So one is a kind of scepticism to science and scientific claims. And you actually get this from both the left and the right. So it's common to say that, the far right are anti-science. Well, they are. I mean, and you have to look at climate change denial and so on. But the left also do it. So genetic modification of foods and so on. Anti-vaccination tends to be a left-wing position. So you get both sides. There's a general scepticism towards science across the public. That's understandable. I mean, how can I put this? I study the philosophy of science, so where the philosophy of science is at the moment, and this is a real problem, even for somebody like me who's supposed to be able to sift through the evidence and kind of look at the data. Science, we have what's called theoretical holism. I don't want to get too technical here because I'm aware the audience is probably not primarily academics. But a body of knowledge rests on another body of knowledge, and that body of knowledge rests on another. You can't go, if you're looking, even if you're reading a scientific paper, you cannot unpack all of the assumptions that are built into that paper that make it work. You have to take some things on faith, yeah? So you can't unpack it. So those are always subject to being revised later on by somebody else down the road, which could then bring the whole edifice down. But at the point at which you're reading that specific claim, as Charles Peirce said, you can't doubt everything at the same point in time. It's actually impossible. The other issue with science is there's too much science around. So, I've been told wine is good for me. I've been told wine is bad for me. I've been told don't drink coffee, do drink coffee. You have too much salt. Every claim about just about everything that you get from science has a set of counterclaims. Yeah? Now, how do we as the public go through those claims and decide what's good or bad? It's extremely difficult. So there's too much science. And to be fair, and I have to be careful because I'm saying this in a university, scientists are not great at science communication, and that's one area we really need to improve. There's also the role of expertise is another major problem. So there's a decline in trust of experts. You can trace this to all sorts of things. clearly decline in trust in politicians has been rising, but if you go back to the financial crisis, decline in kind of banking industry, there's a whole kind of set of forces driving a lack of trust in elites and policymakers. And that's part of the post-truth era. The other, of course, is the emergence of social media. So, you know, I mean, I've said this before in public forums, but anybody that's on Twitter, I mean, I'm on Twitter, but if I could get treatment for it, I'd probably leave Twitter. Twitter is just a madhouse, and everybody on Twitter is mad in both senses of the word. They're all angry and they're all mad as well. Twitter's just, you know, Twitter's a place for conspiracy theorists and lunatics. I mean, if I could get anybody knows any treatment, help me, please. So, social media is just there to spread, you know. How do you pick out claims on Twitter? Everybody's just retweeting everything and adding a bit more of their own commentary to the discourse that you just can't tell what the... And, you know, are you going to check all of these sources for everything you read on Twitter? You probably should, but, you know, do you? And then, of course, the emergence of these kind of new forms of social media have led to a fragmentation in what used to be mainstream media that we used to trust. So we don't even know, you know, we can't trust the BBC anymore. You probably maybe shouldn't have. I mean, it might have been very naive to trust the BBC, but all of these things are adding up to an environment which, you know, where the Oxford Dictionary, and John mentioned Colbert, so truth in it, is this idea that emotions matter more in public policy making than facts. People are driven more by emotions than facts today. And that's really the post-truth era. Now, I gave a talk to the Post-Truth Initiative a few weeks ago, and one thing I pick up on that I'm not sure anybody else has mentioned, I don't know if John's going to like this, I love it, but I call it the democratisation of epistemology. And what I mean by this is everybody's, you know, it's like one person, one vote. Everybody's entitled to have their truth, okay? So it is a kind of, it's not scepticism so much as cynicism. So and it is a kind of democratisation of epistemology. So I should have said, actually, incidentally, so the reason we got asked to do this talk, John and I, is we've had these meetings in the Post-Truth Initiative, and John and I tend to disagree. I mean, some people call it bickering, some people say we argue, and somebody even suggested that we're like an old married couple.
No, that was with James Tadarian, not me.
Actually, legally we can't do that yet, but no, who knows, John? The future might well be possible. I'll have to get divorced first, but who knows? But so that we've had this kind of disagreement, and the idea is really to bring it to a different audience and just to throw the ideas out there. So what can I say about truth? Well, truth is, you know, I brought truth with me. You can't see it. It's in my bag, okay? Truth is in my bag. The truth of anything, climate change, politics, is in my bag. And I'll reveal it at the end. It's not for John, it's for somebody else, but truth is in my bag. It's not observable. Truth claims are not kind of... You don't ever possess truth. It's something that you aspire to. And it's that aspirational aspect of truth that makes you sceptical of anybody who comes along and says, this is the truth. If you don't believe in truth, you can't believe in lies. Okay, so your politicians aren't lying to you. Truth is a condition of possibility for lying. Now, take, for example, John mentioned maps. I've actually published a piece on how we use maps to get around the world. Maps are not truthful. Geography is not realistic. But is it true, as John said, that one side of the Pyrenees has a different truth to the other? It could be right. But then you're still committed to truth. There's no avoiding the performative contradiction in all of those claims that you make. I disagree with John on the sex as well. I don't know how John has sex, and I don't really want to know, but I think sex, truth in sex kind of improves it.
All right. What have I been doing for the last 100 years?
Not in public, John. We'll talk about that. I also think John, my token, not John, but the position he's articulating, actually, you know, and it'd be nice to bring Caroline in on this. I don't think there's any philosopher these days really thinks facts are facts are facts. The idea that facts are socially constructed is pretty universally accepted. But there's a difference from saying a fact is socially constructed. I mean, actually, if you think about it, how else could a fact exist? Facts are human products, socially constructed in particular contexts. You know, geographical, in space, time, and so on. How else could they exist? If you've got no humans, you've got no facts. But they are articulations about something that they are not just encased in language. And this, one of the big differences, I think, from John. John comes from what's, I think, I could be wrong, but I'm guessing from what's called the tradition, which is the linguistic turn in philosophy. So it's a tradition which basically saw that all of the real problems in philosophy were actually problems of language. Wittgenstein's integral to that. What's interesting about Wittgenstein is, he almost, I mean, again, Caroline might hate me, but almost makes philosophy departments redundant and they become linguistic departments, because Wittgenstein says all the genuine problems of philosophy are really problems of language. So they're not really genuine problems. So the other thing, trust and truth, absolutely they're related. What is trust? I mean, how can you trust, and this goes back to the sex thing, John, how do you trust somebody if you don't think they're telling you the truth? So the two actually go together. They are linked. They're actually related. So I've just got a buzz on my arm, so it's true, and if I'm going to make what I said, that I'm not going to go on for as long as John, I need to finish, but there's much more I can say. The duck rabbit, you're absolutely right, multiple interpretations, but it's not a way of feeding the rest of the world. It's not. You can't interpret it as a nuclear bomb. There are limits to interpretation that are set by the world itself. Okay? So you can interpret it multiple ways. Everybody accepts that. But you can't just interpret it any way you want. So, to come back to Rorty, this brings me to the politics of all of this. So Rorty, you say, when he's confronted with this problem, shrugged his shoulders and doesn't say anything. I just think that's a damning indictment of any political position, that when you're confronted with somebody that is standing in the UN Security Council and basically saying we're confronting a genocide, and you shrug your shoulders, if that's the political attitude to truth, then we have a major problem. And I think this issue is important, particularly in the context of Brexit, Trump, and others, and the way in which it's become difficult for publics to think about policy. So truth for me is important, but it's in my bag. I don't possess it. John doesn't possess it. But because it's in my bag, every time John says he's got it, I can slap him and say, no, you're not, because it's in my bag. And he can do the same to me. But he can only do that if it's somewhere. It has to be somewhere. Truth can't be in a non-place. So I'll just finish there.
Thanks, Colin. Great. I'm aware that time is a-ticking, and it would be terrific to be able to take some questions from the audience. So I will just be very brief, and then, John, would you like a brief right of reply?
We should probably go straight into...
Do you want to go straight into questions? Yeah. Can I just second something very quickly that Colin said about the importance, it seems to me, of distinguishing between questions about the metaphysics of truth and questions about the politics of truth claims. So, I mean, I'm actually sympathetic to a less caricatured version of view about the metaphysics of truth, the nature of truth that John was rejecting early on. But it seems to me you can hold a representationalist theory of language, and you can believe that, that there are truths out there in some sense, while agreeing at the same time with many of the claims that John made about the politics of truth claims, that often when people go around saying that something is true, is functioning as a sort of endorsement of what they're saying. They're saying, I'm saying this and you should believe it too. And those positions, I think, are consistent, but it's important to distinguish between them. So let me open the floor for questions. Oh my gosh. Should we start? Thank you. Should we start here?
Hi. I don't think this is on, is it?
Try this one. Yeah, that one works.
I'll grab it.
There you go.
It's just so they can hear me. Okay. I'm a bit concerned about how you guys are defining truth more as a commodity rather than more like the experience or the application of truth. It's really easy to have a dialectic argument about it, but so to bring back a very old book that probably everyone forgets, which is Zen in the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance, it doesn't talk about truth being the end goal. It's more about the good behind that belief pattern. I'd like to ask how that would affect where you're coming from as opposed to just this dialectic thing. I mean, I could go further, but I don't want to hold up the mic. Just good as opposed to this truth argument as an objective definition.
John,
Every recorded case of truth claiming and truth telling, living the truth, comes wrapped in language and conceptions of the good. And I don't think we were commodifying it. I mean, you know, the sky's here and we're trying to put on a show, but I think that rule applies, and it's effectively what I said.
Oh, sorry, I've just missed this point. In terms of saying instead of truth or good, where does empowerment lie behind your definition? How does it drive empowerment? Do you think that's still relative or an absolute argument of going?
Do you want me to try and answer now? Yeah? Okay, so how can I put this? So I'm not sure, probably if we had a chat, a more detailed chat, I might understand you differently, but at the moment I'm hearing that you're separating the good from truth, yeah? Now for me...
Not necessarily.
Yeah, okay. For me, I think facts and values are linked. So let me put it this way. People just don't wake up one day and say, oh, today I'm going to be a racist, okay? So people are racist and engage in certain behaviour because of certain social conditions, I think, that make them racist, okay? So there are factual conditions that explain why somebody's a racist. There are factual conditions why somebody might not believe in climate change being human produced. So for me, the explanation of the good has to be embedded within an account of the facts of the situation as best as we understand them, accepting everything that John says about their own interpretation, then orientated towards a public discussion about what is the good that we desire. So I'm with Hume on this. David Hume is a philosopher. You can't move straight from a factual set of propositions to a policy or a value outcome, but you have to think about what's the best policy within the context of the facts that we understand. So for me, the good is always related to the facts. So I don't want, if I've suggested at all that I treat truth as a commodity, I'd apologise for that, because I definitely don't. That's why I brought it back to the politics. For me, truth is deeply political. But it doesn't mean that we can't, you know, just because truth is infused by power, this is a classic Foucault quote, you know, just because truth is geographically time-produced, infused with power, does not mean that some claims are not better than others. And our role, and this is our role in the university, and really if a university gives up on the truth, we may as well all go get different jobs, which I know some people think we probably should do, but I quite like my job. So, you know, a university has to be at least committed, maybe not to truth, but the production of better forms of knowledge. And it's that really, for me, is crucial. We have to have something that we're aspiring to. If we give up that aspiration, we're just keeping ourselves in the job, which, you know, there are some benefits to that, but for me, it's politically suspect.
One sentence, I mean, I think there's room in the same department or school for both of us, because you could infer from what I'm saying that the job of universities is precautionary. It's to warn against the bullshit and the lying and the grand truth claims, let's be blunt, that have had damaging consequences through the whole of human history. You make truth sound so benign, but in fact, you know, truth was periodically murderous. And recent examples, yes, let's invade and destroy Iraq on the basis of the truth about weapons of mass destruction. I mean, so the role of universities is actually to warn against those kinds of grandiose claims. Maybe a good way of thinking about it is that universities are spaces, open spaces, where actually interpretations, plural, can flourish, and where the power that's inherent in all truth claims is exposed, so to say, and where there is some learning and some wisdom about living with others with whom we don't agree. That's, after all, what a democracy is about. My problem with truth is that it's a conversation stopper, as Dick Rorty loved to say. It's got pomposity built into it. And everything you said seems to me to be still thinking along those lines. But I better shut up because...
Can I just answer that? I know loads of people are waiting, but here's the thing. I mean, the vocation of an academic, it's slightly naive, but I'm still committed to a version of it, is that we speak truth to power, okay? I don't think that John gets to say that his view is the one that exposes truth claims that are incorrect. The Iraq War, it's exactly my research area. The reason that the Iraq War is understood the way it is they made intelligence claims, they made claims in the UN that there were weapons of mass destruction, and it was simply false. It was not true. And that exposing of the lie relies on the fact that the weapons weren't there, a certain truth. And so you have to have that aspect of it.
Yes, next question here. Yes.
Would it help to reconcile your views to, let's say, borrow from economics, where we move from rationality, like we assume that humans are purely rational, into bounded rationality? So could there be like bounded truthiness, like it's a spectrum but it's bounded? And also would it help to borrow from complexity science, that you can't see the whole complexity, you can just probe it, and maybe instead of fighting what the truth is, we should argue on the process, how sound is the process we use to arrive at different truths, maybe. Instead of the outcome, it's the process we should look at.
May I speak as the avatar of John?
Yes. Should we have 3-minute responses from each? Because I think there's about 6 or 7, at least, people in the queue.
Democracy is all about bounded rationality and respect, sensitivity to complexity. It's against know-alls.
And for me, absolutely, what I'm talking about is bounded epistemology. I've admitted that it's socially constructed, but again, it's an epistemology that is aspiring to go beyond itself, even if you fail in the aspiration. So we might agree on that one, which is boring, but...
Yes, over there in the brown jacket, so I don't know your name.
I just wanted to, well, it might be annoying, but I'll bring us back to Richard Rorty for a second, because he distinguishes a couple of different uses of truth. And on the one hand, you have one he calls the explanatory notion of truth, and that's the kind where saying this statement is true is going to kind of end a conversation, or that's where it will serve as a conversation stopper, and he obviously dislikes that and wants to get rid of it. But elsewhere, he sometimes allows what's called a promissory notion of truth, where it kind of serves as a promise or enters you into an agreement to provide the justifications for that claim. Could there be any way where, given the post-truth era we're in, we see ourselves as moving towards what Rorty saw as the promissory notion of truth, where saying something of truth doesn't alleviate us of the responsibility to prove it's true, but rather enters us into a promise or an agreement to do exactly that?
Can I answer that first?
Yes.
Absolutely. I mean, I have the same issue with Foucault. So people, the Foucault, rather than the Foucault industry, accepts the idea that there's this thing called truth, and it's that allows Foucault to say that there are regimes of truth that are not true. So Foucault has to have an idea of truth. It's best in the essay on polemics, for example, and politics. He articulates it very clearly there. It's an interview. So where people say Foucault doesn't have a concept of truth, he has many, that's the point. But he still, at the bottom, he has one that about being assertive of truth. On Rorty, the thing I think Rorty's a bit disingenuous. So I think every truth claim is promising in that sense, that anybody making a truth claim has to validate it in some way. And there are lots of what I call epistemological supports. I tell my students to do this. Every sentence you read in an article or book, what is the basis of the epistemology that the author's making that claim on? And you can unpick you can go through and do a close reading and unpick every claim an author makes and say, Well, how did they know that? What's the basis of that claim? So I think that happens. I mean, I find Rorty, though, Rorty for me he's disingenuous because he actually just seems to accept science but doesn't want to think about how it works. So Rorty accepts the truths of science, doesn't want to challenge them. He basically says they're not really kind of something we can challenge. We live within science, I think, for Rorty. So he doesn't even see, I want to challenge science to give us those promissory notes. I don't want to give anybody a free pass.
Thank you. There was another question over here on early on. I saw a hand go up. Is that lady in the red job? I don't want to put your. Did you put your hand up? No, it's like an option.
John, you mentioned three philosophers: Nietzsche and Wittgenstein and Karl Popper. Karl Popper, if anything, personifies the need for truth or the aspiration of searching for truth by permanent justification. So I think I take a different interpretation on Karl Popper, and with respect to the other two philosophers, I think they fall into the category of the dark and the disbelieving, or skeptic fraternity, and how can we derive a benefit from that relative to other philosophers. Now, I just want to mention a question about, in a democracy, how can you progress if you deny the aspiration of truth? If governments in power owe a contract to a populace in a society and they want to survive, I can't see that you can deny the aspiration of truth, because power will abuse it without. Could you address that, please?
Well, Colin's saying something very similar, but three things. Popper is, of course, the great champion of the fallibility principle. So, but if you read him carefully and you look at the corpus of his works, there are sort of two faces of Popper. One is that there's always doubt from his point of view about the language that's being used and the methods that are mobilized to prove something. And he's very well aware that what counts as truth at any point in time is shot through with time, that it changes through time. On the other hand, the other face of Popper, as I read him, is that he does actually think in what's called objectivist terms. You know, that there is a reality out there that is graspable, it's testable. Science is potentially progress towards sort of grasping that reality. And I think that this is not the occasion to have a debate about Thomas Kuhn's critique of Popper and all of that, but I think that's just worth pointing out. You are right, secondly, about the strange implications, political implications, that are drawn on the basis of some attachment to truth or critique of truth. Nietzsche, I mean, my whole work is in a way an imminent critique of Nietzsche. You know, Nietzsche's view is that 19th century Europe is asleep, slovenliness, democracy is homogenizing everything, there's no greatness anymore, there's no will to power. What we see much more clearly in retrospect, the whole entanglement of Nietzsche with fascism is, you know, a big discussion. But the celebration of the will to power, it seems to me, underestimated the abuse of power. And the 20th century was, you know, involved monstrous cases of the abuse of power. And as for Wittgenstein, you know, at the end of his analytic period, he actually he tries to go to the Soviet Union, I think, to be a bricklayer, or he has in mind that he's going to be a bricklayer and he's going to help build socialism. And he quickly abandons that idea. Later on, Wittgenstein is sort of wobbles all over the place. And there's even some suggestions of, you know, the metaphysics of God. But there's a kind of withdrawal, there's a retreatism that comes from his idea that life is nothing but interpretations and entangled interpretations and the conflict among interpretations. What I've tried to do is to say that democracy can be rethought. It has a history of thinking of itself as a first principle, you know, that it's God-given, etc. You can get rid of all that metaphysics and you can think about democracy as a way of life, a way of handling power that's constantly worried about the abuse of power. Now, you say that you have to have truth to do that. I actually think that not only is truth dangerous, and it has a track record of proving to be dangerous. Look at what Modi is doing to India in the name of truth. You can do that exposure of power, that accountability, that monitoring of power in all kinds of ways. You can do it satirically, you can do it through joke-telling, and of course you do it through interpretations. So what does Glenn Greenwald do? I don't believe, but I'm going to have a look at the record that I said, what, 6 times that everything he said was true?
No.
5.
No.
Or was that my avatar?
No.
Me.
Get it right, John. This is why getting things right is important. This is why truth is important. What I said was, you make a claim about truth on the Greenwald talk. It was in the piece on monitoring democracy that you mentioned truth 6 times.
Yeah, well, sloppiness, you know.
Yeah, that's why truth is important.
That was not me. Anyway, so
True. What John means is.
Yeah, and one last thing. The basic difference between Colin and my avatar is that Colin keeps saying, you know, I'm speaking the language of truth, that I'm contradicting myself, that there's a big performative contradiction this afternoon. And I say, in reply, that's an interpretation, Colin, and all I'm doing is interpreting the world. You know, may the better interpretation persuade others that you know, this interpretation or that is... it doesn't require truth, as democracy doesn't require truth. And Hannah Arendt, one last sentence, it's true that it's true. It's true. I'm troping. She is prone, in certain texts, to say that the great catastrophe of totalitarianism, of the Stalinist and the Nazi form, was its destruction of truth, understood as factuality. But there are other times in the Watergate essays where she says, actually, I think she comes to her senses and she says, actually, something quite different, which is that truth is destructive of politics. Because when people say, it's true, you know, it's true, that's the moment at which an accumulation of power and an attempt to persuade people, to draw people in happens. And that, as we know, is a dangerous moment, or it can be for democracy. So you can do democracy without truth.
Yes. Yeah, you've been waiting patiently. Thank you.
Isn't truth what people believe? They believe something, so they think it's true. They don't check on it normally. For instance, this morning sometimes I was reading something and it says whatever it was about was going to be a David and Goliath fight. Now, I know exactly what that person meant, and I guess everybody in this room knows. But in fact, it's not right. If you go back to the David and Goliath time, it was a no contest. David was going to win. A slingsman was a very dangerous opponent. And he is standing 50 meters, 40 meters away from a guy who is all armored and can't move. Who's going to win? But the assumption is that it was poor little David that was the hero. He wasn't. Not many people think it's true. Many people take the trouble to find out where it comes from, what it is. They've heard it, they think they understand, they believe it. It's their truth.
I'm not sure how, because I'm with you on the David and Goliath story, but then I'm against you on it's truth is just belief. I mean, philosophers have spent a long time, they call it epistemology, separating out doxa, belief, from episteme, knowledge. Okay, so now part of my argument is that what we need for a better policy, a better politics, and this is where John and I fundamentally disagree, is we do need. So when, for me, when the politician comes along and says, this is the truth, if there is no truth, but there is just the interpretation, why should you challenge him? And here's the real problem. When you've got two different interpretations, so you've got Trump saying his crowd is bigger than Obama's, yeah? So now, that's his interpretation. The idea of alternative facts is not strange to most academics. So that's what was really funny when was the furore when Kellyanne Conway mentioned alternative facts. For most academics, and it's interesting that John mentions Kuhn, you can have the idea of alternative facts. So to answer your question specifically, we need, where people are just thinking what's true is what I believe, that's exactly what we need to challenge. We need to ask them, we need to look at why do people believe that? Why do certain people believe that climate change is not human produced?
There's a question over here, and then...
Does it follow on from that, then, that truth is really just a matter of perspective? That's all I have.
Gosh, we're shocked by the brevity.
That's a classic, well-formed position within philosophy. The truth is just different perspectives. I've got my perspective. To come to Kuhn, I'll just try and explain. I don't know if people know Kuhn that much, but so Kuhn. I don't think John Kuhn is a good example of where the philosophy of science is at the moment. The book was published in 1962. He uses a load of terms, one in particular, paradigms. Kuhn is basically a historian of science. And what he's trying to do is he's trying to explain he's trying to explain scientific progress. And what he actually uncovers is there is no real clear account of progress of science. Science doesn't progress for Kuhn. It moves from one period, he calls them paradigms, to another. So the move from, say, classical mechanics to Einsteinian relativity is supposed to be what he calls a Gestalt switch. And for Kuhn, there are no facts that explain that move from classical mechanics to Einstein. It's basically because the facts in classical mechanics don't exist in an Einsteinian world. That's where the idea of alternative facts makes perfect sense. Problem is, Kuhn then got a lot of criticism for this book, published in '62, called The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, and then wrote an afterword deeply critical of the way people had interpreted him, but for saying that there was no progress. So he later, just as you say with Arendt, Kuhn later came to say, I didn't mean any of this. And the other thing I would say about, we're both guilty of doing this, John, but you should not take philosophers too seriously. And just to give you an example here, because academics like to throw philosophers around, but here's a historical example of why you shouldn't take them seriously. So Imre Lakatos was a student of Karl Popper's, and Paul Feyerabend, again, somebody who you may not know, Paul Feyerabend was against the idea of science, and he thought science was just similar to modern-day witchcraft. It's just a form of knowledge we have now. So Feyerabend used to go to Lakatos's lectures and barrack lectures, like a heckler at a comedy show. He would heckle Lakatos and, go on all about this idea of reason and so on that Lakatos focused on. So Lakatos got so annoyed, they were good friends, so Lakatos got so annoyed he said, why don't you write all this up in formal terms and then give me a chance to respond to it? So Feyerabend wrote this book at the most extreme end of the argument called Against Method, an anarchist theory of knowledge, and he was joking in half the book. If you look at the correspondence between him and Lakatos, he's not serious. He's saying he's putting the most absurd argument to see how Lakatos would respond. Problem was, Lakatos died before he could do his response. So the Feyerabend book just sits there as its own entity, and loads of people read it and don't understand the deeper context. So philosophers should not be taken too seriously.
It's not the place for me to respond to that on behalf of philosophers. Next question. Yeah. Yes.
My question actually follows on pretty well with what Colin just said. I was wondering whether John could comment on the way that these truth claims are butt against the world in some way. They're not just a social force. And that, say, a particularly striking example might be if you got chronic myeloid leukemia in the 1990s, you would die within 5 to 6 years. If you get it today, you take a pill, a tyrosine kinase inhibitor, and your cancer melts away and you will live to a normal life expectancy. So we can talk about science as a social process, models as ways of understanding, ways of communicating, absolutely. But it seems strange to deny that the community of cancer scientists haven't latched onto something. There's something, it's a loaded word, truth, but there's something in the actual world which that community has latched onto. But yeah, whether you could comment on that.
I guess that one's for me.
Sounds like it, John.
I mean, I think one of the interesting things that surfaced here, and I'm blowing my geography of truth trumpet, is that there are multiple usages of truth, and we shouldn't lump all of them, certainly not historically. You can't lump together, Christian, Augustinian notions of truth with what the Greeks understood by ality and so on. That we shouldn't lump them together, and we should differentiate. That's a point in my favour, or in favour of John's avatar. And here is a case in point of the pragmatics of truth. I mean, pragmatists would say yes. I mean, this is James, and it's also Rorty, who would say yes, there are certain claims to truth using certain methods, practices, lived practices of truth that have pragmatic effects. They work. And that I'm certainly prepared to concede, and any democracy needs such claims. Because
it's not an accident that they work.
Yeah,
right?
the question is why they work.
Yes, but then a follow-up remark, which is this seems to put those who are practicing truth, in this case the oncologists, on a pedestal. They know, with a capital K, they know what's true with a capital T, or so we could be persuaded to think. And here I've always loved the remark, and it's a short essay by Niels Bohr, about truth and expertise. And this is work that comes out of the quantum tradition. James is here, knows much better about this, knows in quotation marks, that Bohr said, hitherto science, European science, has supposed with its search for factuality, the development of empirical methods, has thought of itself on the royal road to truth. And Popper still carries that on, it seems to me. And Bohr says, thinking of the bomb that's just about to be dropped on Nagasaki and Hiroshima, maybe truth and expertise should be reconfigured, rethought, so that the true expert, the expert who is sensitive to truth, is the one who warns his or her colleagues that they don't know everything, and that they have to keep their minds open to the possibility that they are wrong. And I like that very much, and it seems to me that democracies, when they function well, create those spaces in a way that no other political form does. It's not time for a history of political forms, but let's run through them. Tyranny, monarchy, theocracy, you can run. All of those political forms suppose that those who rule are entitled to rule, either because they're God-given or because they have certain attributes. They are true forms of power. They guard themselves, they clothe themselves in power. Democracy is the only form, and the Chinese model, by the way, of one-party socialism and so on, would fit in that latter category. Democracy is the only political form that actually when it functions, creates spaces where there are multiple forms of truth, including the pragmatic versions, but where there's a lot of doubt about truth because of its bad track record historically. And I think this point is being underestimated. It all sounds like roses. It all smells great. But the history of truth is the history of slaughter. It's the history of domination of peoples. And just one cursory look at the history of Christianity would show that, which is why John Anderson in this room got himself into such hot water by attacking the church and causing scandals on the grounds that they were hypocrites, power lovers, and actually, had damaging consequences on Australian democracy, I think. That's an interpretation.
May I just also jump in before Colin? I mean, it strikes me this is a kind of selective history of truth. Of course, what you say is right, that it's been abused, truth claims have been used and abused in all sorts of ways, but there are also kind of good examples, civil rights activists appealing to truth to gain progress, feminist movements. There's plenty of times where calls to truth have played a very important role in positive social change.
Just very quickly, I mean, I think, John, really, like the oncologists and the scientists, I mean, because I do research in the philosophy of science and philosophy of social science, that's just the wrong way. They're not. What drives scientists is actually a kind of an incessant scepticism. So they make a claim and they don't set themselves up as some major authority. It's always like, this is what the community thinks now. We can go with that now, and it might be on pragmatic terms, but at some point down the road, they're going to come back to what I call a realist model of science, and they're going to go, is this really the case? And the quantum mechanics is the best one, because if you speak to the people in the quantum lab here, they'll tell you that they actually can now do stuff with quantum phenomena that where Bohr and others didn't think that the things existed. They were just instrumental devices. But they're actually now proven that they existed, and they could do stuff with them. One just being able to split the atom. I mean, that seems to me pretty impressive kind of example of how, certain things about science can be true. So, yeah, it's a royal road, John. It is. You're absolutely right. But it is a road. You're never at the end point, and that's the whole point about it. Because the truth is in my bag, until I open the bag, you ain't getting it.
So can I just clarify, are there true statements in your bag?
No, there's a truth in the bag, which you'll see at the end. I hope I get a minute to reveal the truth at the end. But but the final thing is...
Very small bag.
The slaughter... Well, we don't know how big or small truth is, John. That's the point. Just the thing on the slaughter, yes, absolutely it has. But these are political truths. But how do we know that these political truths are being employed in the slaughter of multiple people over historical time? Well, we know through examining them and exposing these supposed truths as being untrue. So it's, you still needed to demonstrate the fact of what you're saying.
No. One of my teachers was Hans-Georg Gadamer, whose great book Truth and Method probably none of you have ever read. It's not in fashion. He was a student of Heidegger's, and his reply to that would be to say, that's an interpretation. Interpretations are valuable, and they're actually important, vital for people's lives, because it's through interpretations that, in his view, we create traditions that are meaningful, that are lived, that give us an anchor in the world, which otherwise would be meaningless and where self-destructiveness would follow. So this would be his reply, and I think it fits very well with the whole discussion about science.
I've read Gadamer, John, and the problem is, here's the problem. Yes, it's an interpretation. I've admitted that. I don't know anybody that won't say these are interpretations. Facts don't speak for themselves, but some interpretations are better than others. And it's not the fact that it's just an interpretation doesn't mean they're all equal. And the thing is, how do you decide which one is better than the other? And it's that process that in a post-truth age we seem to have given up on.
Brilliant, thanks. I'm not a political theorist, so I'm going to steer away from the names and the philosophers and try and bring this back to practical democratic politics, and particularly something you both touched on, which was the link between trust and truth. So I agree with you, Colin, that truth may be in your bag and there is a value to science and expertise, but that's not the truth we have in democratic politics. What we have are the socially constructed interpretations that John has talked about more in his speech. We have political parties who each put forward a contested interpretation of the truth in any single policy domain for the people or social groups they supposedly represent. And insofar as interpretations of truth matter, it could be that the policy outcomes, the material policy outcomes, are the truths you're talking about, Colin, produced by the interpretations that John has talked about. I mean, every single day in the UK for the last 2 years, I've heard different contestations about the truth of Brexit and what that will mean. The real truth might be the daily effects on people's lives after we finally plunge out in 2019. But in terms of democracy in its representative form, the average person on the street sees their MP or political party as a lightning rod for their interpretation of the truth. And when those interpretations aren't made manifest in policy outcomes, then they distrust those who they believed were furthering their interpretations. And the repeated distrust created in that process pushes them to disengage from democratic politics and therefore undermines our chosen form of politics. So is the future of democracy dependent on breaking that link between trust and truth? Or actually, do we need a different alternative political form that can sustain itself alongside that symbiosis between truthiness and trust?
Thank you. Before our speakers reply, we have 3 minutes remaining, so is it possible to condense your replies?
Yeah, just very quickly, I'll be very quick. I don't think you can break the link between truth and trust. I think trust relies on if you look at John loves this, the etymology of the word and so on, so it relies on reliability. You begin to trust people because of iterations over time, that they show some kind of honesty, that it is embedded in the fact that they can actually be trusted because they are truth tellers. I mean, would you trust somebody that you thought was lying to you all of the time? Well, actually, it's a silly question because he's called Donald Trump. So, yes, you would. Or 62 million or so seem to, but maybe that's because they don't care about truth.
I have a split reaction to the question, as always. And the split reaction goes something like this. I mean, I think that we should calm ourselves and be a bit more relaxed about the whole truth question, and, or to put it in another language, multiple interpretations. I'm sure I'm not the only one in this room who lives my daily life and in institutions, dealing chronically, constantly with differences of perspective. It's life. And I don't see that we need to poison any of this or stir trouble up by sticking the label of truth on things. And if I were a psychoanalyst of this, I'd say something like, it's Nietzsche's madman. It's like we're still coming to terms with the problem of the breakdown of absolute truth, aka Christianity. We're still coming to terms with that problem. But we should chill a bit and we should relax. That's one side. And democracies, for that reason, seem to me to be perfectly capable of functioning and certainly understandable in terms of winning trust by using the word truth or not. I think that I was a bit misunderstood when it's Gianni Vattimo, truth is persuasion. It means that when you start using the word truth, or when you're peddling interpretations, you're trying to win people's affections and support. You're trying to persuade them that what you're saying is plausible. And that's in short supply in actually existing democracies. And how it can be rebuilt is another discussion. But here's the other side. One of my favorite aphorisms, it's a downer to end on, is Walter Benjamin. In the mid-1920s, with fascism breathing down the neck, truth is coming. Benjamin said, and I think it's a principle that all Democrats should take seriously, small d Democrats, that the aphorism was mistrust, and again mistrust, all agreements, all consensuses, all trust that exists between individuals and classes and nations. And only trust, he said, in IG Farben, the chemical industry that collaborated with the Nazis, and the Luftwaffe, the German Air Force. He was being utterly sarcastic. So a democracy needs healthy measures of mistrust and distrust of power, because there ain't no God, and no monarch or no tyrant or no theocrat can sort all this out for us. And if you think they can, then have a look at the historical record, and I think you'll be sadly disappointed about the outcomes. So we're left with democracy as a kind of system in which there is this ongoing dialectic, this sort of dynamic, where trust winning is really important, and it's in short supply, but where mistrust of power, scepticism about power, outright contestation of power is essential to keep things moving, to keep things open towards a greater equality. Well, that's what I think.
Thank you, John.
And now the bag is to be opened.
Any guesses? No, I won't get it.
Is it chocolate?
No, it's not. Actually, no, John.
I'm not allowed to look.
No, you're not allowed to look. So, truth is a good bottle of wine.
Very good.
Which I brought for Caroline, who actually is a philosopher who could have done a much better job on the panel than Trina, that either of us two white men have done waffling on about truth.
Not
so
true.
thanks to Caroline.
In vino veritas.
Oh, wonderful.